dating system. He wrote a famous book which he called the Hafid al-Falasifa, which means refutation or floundering of the philosophers' refutation, in which he objected to 20 propositions that the philosophers said, 20 statements, 20 dogmatic points of the philosophers. So he brought his own philosophical arguments, saying, no, the philosophers say this, but this is wrong because, well, he goes on for 25, 30 pages, arguing this purely philosophical discussion. In 3 of those positions that the philosophers held, he at the end finds them guilty of, what do you call it? Kufr, yes, exactly. Blasphemy and, or basically unbelief, so to speak. Even if they're Muslims, you're not supposed to say these things. And then this was, well, it made sensationalistic history perhaps in the Western literature, I think, not so much immediately in the Islamic world. But in any case, people found this a useful point to say, ah, well, you see, there it is, 1111, he dies and he writes this thing, and then after that we have in Andalus, in Spain, we have only Averroes, the following 12th century, and then after that he kills off philosophy and all that. As a matter of fact, I think actually what he did was the opposite, because he allowed logic, and he introduced, as a matter of fact, Aristotelian logic into theological reasoning as such. He gave an impetus to the greater philosophization of even Islamic theology as such. And beyond that, of course, philosophers writing in Arabic after that continued doing that happily for the following 6, 7 centuries anyway, as it is. But this again is one of those myths that the Westerners like to play with and throw about for that thing. So, and as a matter of fact, I don't know how influential that book was until much, much later, if at all. Because certainly, see, Al-Ghazali was a professor at the new university that was established in Baghdad, right with the Nizamiya, right after the famous vizier of the Seljuk, Nizam al-Mulk. So he was very much part of the establishment. Obviously, he was, so to speak, an establishment professor. So and he comes up with this writing, but he had a very bad reputation among his colleagues. I don't think any other of the professors at the Nizamiya liked him. And they certainly don't refer to this book right after the next 2 centuries after that. They go on studying philosophy without any mention that this has been an inhibiting factor in that, basically. So we still have to study the after effect of this book, but this is still a study that has to be done. Of course, Averroes himself wrote a refutation, the Hafid al-Hafid, refutation of the refutation, and that was pretty famous. And then, of course, our Ottoman scholars in the 15th century picked up and they continued this dialogue of the Hafid series of philosophy, etc. So it was certainly a productive work in the sense that people took it seriously and they read it, but they read it primarily as a philosophical work in any case. The same thing with Averroes objected to it not because it destroyed philosophy, objected to it because he said your arguments against those positions of the philosophers are wrong, and they're wrong because ABC, obviously. So he gave counter-philosophical arguments. So it was a very productive philosophical discussion across centuries, basically, in different kinds. We have Ghazali writing, let's say, in Baghdad or in Nishapur where he was, or then goes to Andalusia, he goes to Ibn Rushd, responds to that, and then in Istanbul, the Ottoman scholars respond. So, so as I said, it's a wonderful dialogue going across countries and across centuries, but not that kind of thing.
In that Walterized version of this thing, there's this, to him is attributed to the idea that faith is what you really should trust, and not these rationalistic arguments.
No.
No?
Ghazali was great for logic. He wrote 3 or 4 books on logic, different variations of that. 3 of them basically summarize Avicenna's logic, the earlier philosopher's logic. And one of them, as a matter of fact, the Qisas al-Mustaqim, which means the right balance taken from the Quran. He tries to find logical arguments in the Quran itself. So he finds it's an argument in the Quran, he says this is a particular kind of logical argument. So even the Quran is using logic in a sense. So logic, and he also said that his It is neither good nor bad, so to speak, if you use logic, and the very fact that he himself used it gave great impetus to logic being introduced into the Islamic sciences as such, into theology definitely, and even into law. Islamic law, there are two parts of it. One deals about the details, and the other is the principles of Islamic law, the usul, as they say. And after Ghazali, who himself was a great legal scholar, after Al-Ghazali, we find the law books written about the principles of Islamic law, beginning with the first chapter on logic, epistemology. That is, if we're going to write about logic and the principles of Islamic law, well, what are the epistemological grounds and bases that we want to do that? And they basically, again, discuss very much along Avicenna logical principles as such. So all this, Ghazali was, I think, himself responsible to a certain extent, and not just by himself, but among other things that also helped a lot. No, I don't think that I would be discussing that. I don't know if somebody asks, obviously, but that's something else. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the excellent talk. I have a question about, the brief history of Islamic studies that you've given us. It seems to me that if you were giving this talk in 1909 rather than 2009, you could level much of the same criticisms against the scholarship that had been done 50 years before you were talking. And but then again, I'm thinking you would be fine because you would know that most of the people who were doing Arabic Islamic studies would have studied at the theology department and would, in one way or another, have a sort of mental habit to relate things to religion. Right? For example, someone like Nöldek or Wellhausen would also work on early, Jewish texts. But I'm wondering why this structure that seems to be an accident to the mental habits of 19th century people has been so lasting.
Well, I think that has to do very much with the history, the colonialist history of the West, I think, in the 20th century. It is an easy explanation when you do not try to understand a society and you simply attribute everything to one part of it, aspect of it, and the one, of course, which is not commendable, so to speak, they are the bad Muslims, because they're not Christians or whatever. I mean, I'm simplifying very much, but this has been the attitude, and also, as I said, it explains, gives the appearance of explanation without really explaining, and also because it feeds upon the biases of the audience as such, it is easily acceptable by the audience as well. Otherwise, you have to do some serious work into the society that you want to study and try to find out some real reasons, which again, some people may not be interested, may not understand, you can only be talking to a specialized audience, but this is something that catches the attention. People are eager to believe it because they already have this bias, in a sense. And I think the point that you raise is very, very correct, in that many of these scholars, when dealing with Christianity and philosophy as such, again, try to see the conflict between religion and philosophy as such. So they themselves were predisposed to see this kind of problem as well in Islam. Well, Islam, as far as I know, it wasn't really ever a problem. Not a problem, but something that really very much discussed. We have one great treatise by Averroes himself, the Fasl al-Maqal, in which he says the relationship between exactly the problem, religion and philosophy. But he says this is a legal problem. And he himself was a great jurist himself, of course, Averroes. So he goes on there to discuss this issue.
Andalusian science and philosophy had opened the way on the maybe Andalusian Renaissance, but it was written in Arabic and it may be well used by the Muslim countries, but they couldn't use it. Do you agree with this issue?
No, the fact is that Averroes himself, take Averroes and then also Andalusian science, but Averroes himself and his writings were not read in the East. Few people were aware of it, and certainly scholars were aware of it in English. But the problem with him, from the point of view of philosophers in the East, is that he was superseded. That is, he was writing about old stuff that philosophically, philosophers in the East had left behind. And by that I mean the philosophy of Avicenna. what Avicenna did is really take the basis of the Aristotelian system, most of it, and so synthesize it and bring in certain questions that were important in his time and some of his own thoughts, and create somehow a higher synthesis, straying in many things away from what Aristotle himself says. Averroes did exactly the opposite. He went to the very text of Aristotle, the Arabic translations, that is, all the Aristotelian texts, and he wrote commentaries explaining exactly what Aristotle says. And in fact, he was such a good commentator on the text of Aristotle that some of his explanations are even espoused today by classical scholars who read the Greek text. So he really had great insight into what Aristotle actually said. But his interpretation, for the most part, was an interpretation of the Aristotelian text rather than a philosophical position. He does have, of course, a philosophical position, but many times, and especially in the most important one about the nature of the human soul, he changes his mind, as a good scholar should do, because he gives a first interpretation in one book, but then after 20 years he revisits the problem, he thinks about it, he has new information, he says, no, what I said before is not right, there is the real answer to that. So he was much more of a, I would say, well, not textual critic, but textual expositor within a larger frame, of course, that he had to do, but he really understood Aristotle. Now, this kind of thing, Avicenna had left behind, again, in the good sense, had provided a higher synthesis. So the scholars after Averroes, reading that, they said, no, this is old stuff, you know, we're already beyond that. So they did not pay too much attention to it. Although, to their credit, especially during the Safavid period in Iran, they copied quite a few of the works by Averroes. So we have some Safavid time copies surviving today in manuscripts. So they were scholarly, they were of course interested, but not philosophically. The one person who took him even more seriously, and he quotes him and he argues sometimes with him, was the great Ibn Taymiyyah, who, although he was a very traditionalist scholar, he was an extremely intelligent person, extremely honest scholar, I find. And he writes, and whatever he writes, he takes arguments from the philosopher and he says, no, this is wrong because of this and that, and he argues against them. In very, very well. Of course, one may not agree with him, but he does quote Averroes. So people were aware, of course, of Averroes, and they had access to the writings, but they simply, the philosophers, those who wrote philosophy, did not feel that it contributed anything to what they had to say.
What I mean, you know, especially, for example, one of the Moroccan scholars, Jabiri, he argues that, you know, it's a very controversial issue, but he says that if the Muslim was aware about what Ibn Khaldun or the Rushd done in the history, or their approach to science and religion, maybe they